Are there any animals that have a brain in different places?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So for example, the squid had its brain wrapped around its throat, and that means it has to be really careful when it's eating, because if it gets a bone or something spiky stuck in its throat, it's not just going to be uncomfortable for it, but it could end up with brain damage.
Are there any animals that don't have a brain?
So it really depends what you call a brain. Basically, any sort of organism that can move has some sort of brain, but it's not always a brain like we think of it, like humans and monkeys and cats and dogs would have. So some animals that don't really have heads, like starfish or jellyfish, they don't have a brain like we have a brain, but they do have some brain cells or neurons that are kind of helping them to move. The jellyfish needs to kind of move, or the starfish needs to be able to eat. And it's these sorts of nerve cells that help them do that. So as animals get more and more complex, their brains get more complex too. So animals that are very small but who have a head, like certain kinds of insects or tapeworm or something like that, they have kind of a head with a very, very tiny brain, but it really only lets them do the simple things that they have to do. So animals have some sort of nervous system, but it really depends what you want to call a brain.
Do worms have brains?
They don't have brains quite like we do. Our brains are very complicated and they've got lots of different parts to them that allow us to do different things. Worm brains are they're very simple. They're basically just a clump of cells that allow them to do things like crawl and eat and poop.
Do animals have different sized brains?
Yes, animals have very different sized brains because animals themselves can be very different sizes. So normally, the smaller the animal, the smaller their brain, and the bigger the animal, the bigger their brain.
Which animal has the biggest brain?
So the elephant has the largest brain of any land animal, but the animal with the biggest brain of all is a sperm whale. And the sperm whale had a brain that weighs 7 kilograms, which is almost 6 times as much as your human brain weighs. With smallest brains, it's a bit difficult to tell because it all depends on, what really counts as a brain. But something like a worm had a really tiny brain, so that might be an example.
Does the size of an animal affect the size of the brain?
Yes, for the most part. So smaller animals normally have smaller brains, and bigger animals normally have bigger brains. But that doesn't necessarily mean that bigger animals with bigger brains are smarter than small animals. Because the bigger an animal, the bigger their body is too, and so their brain has to be bigger in order to control that bigger body. It also depends what different brains are specialized to do. So animals have evolved to have a brain that helps them do what they need to do in their everyday life. So for example, rats have a very small brain because they're a small animal, but the part of their brain that has to do with smelling is really big in comparison to their brain as a whole, because for rats, who are usually in kind of dark sewers, smelling is really important for them to explore their environment. So the part of their brain for smelling is really big. So in a way, rats are almost smarter when it comes to smelling than we are, even though our brains are much bigger, and most people would say that we're much smarter than rats.
Is your brain made of different colours?
No, not really. If you cut into a brain, if it was healthy and living, it would all be pink and kind of squishy, a little bit like the rest of the human body. Sometimes we call it different colours. You might have heard of grey matter and white matter. And this is to do with the way that different parts of the brain show up on a brain scan, and it's to do with things like how much fat is in the different sections of the brain. Another way you might have thought that the brain is different colours is that sometimes when we do scans of how the brain works, we highlight in the pictures that we show different parts of the brain that are active in different colours to show that. But no, your brain's pink.
What's the brain made out of?
Ooh, the brain is made of all sorts of stuff. The brain is made up of cells, just like all the tissues in the body, but the cells in the brain are very specialised. They come in a number of different types, and the most important type are cells called neurons, or nerve cells. Those are cells that have a long spindly axon, which it uses to send electrical impulses to other nerve cells, and a tree-like set of dendrites, which receive impulses from other nerve cells. Those nerve cells are incredibly small. There would be 100,000 of them in a cubic millimetre. That is a little cube which is 1 millimetre on a side. And they're surrounded by other types of cells called glia, which are cells that support and enfold those nerve cells. All of those cells connected together, and all of those cells make up the brain that sits inside our heads.
Can your brain shrink?
I think the answer to that is yes. So what we can show is that as you get older, and we're really talking about sort of very old people in their sort of 60s and older, they tend to show that the size of their brain shrinks as they reach that older age. There's also some evidence to suggest perhaps that our brain can get slightly smaller when it gets better at doing things. So it's becoming slightly more efficient at doing a particular job. It might get slightly smaller.
Is the brain a living thing? If it is, what's keeping it alive?
The brain is alive, and the brain is part of your body, so it's alive. Your brain is incredibly expensive in terms of energy, so you actually your body has to do a lot of work to get energy to your brain. So your brain's using a lot of the oxygen that you get coming into your body, and your brain's actually using a lot of the food that comes into your body to just simply to exist as a brain. It actually costs a lot to have this organ in our heads. And then beyond that, you also do a little bit more work every time you actually do something with your brain. So it's an expensive piece of kit that we've got.
Does your brain have a brain?
Your brain doesn't have a brain so much, but there are parts of the brain that seem to be really important in controlling the rest of the brain. So there are some parts of your brain which are sort of in charge, and if you have damage to your brain that actually affects those, then your behaviour can become a little bit harder to control. So it does seem that it's not the case that your brain has a brain, but some bits of your brain are more in charge than other bits.
How do you use your brain?
How you use your brain depends a little bit on who you are and a little bit on what you're thinking about or what you're doing. So the type of way in which you use your brain if you're in a PE lesson is perhaps a little bit different to if you're in a mathematics lesson. In one case you're thinking about maths problems and numbers, and in another case you're thinking about how to move your body or how to do a handstand or a cartwheel. So how you use your brain depends on what you want to use it for. And there are also subtle differences across people in how their brain works. For example, our personalities, how we come across, that is in part dictated by how our brains are slightly different.
How can you increase your brain power?
Basically, you have to use it. So the more you use it, your brain power will be increased. So for example, you have to read more, you have to talk to people more, you have to read more. And if you learn a new skill like playing piano or playing a new sport, and your brain power will be increased as well. So the basic idea is just use it as more as you can. That's all.
What helps the brain to control our thinking?
That's a really good question. What helps our brain control our thinking? Well, in part, it's our brain itself, because the brain is full of nerve cells that are incredibly connected to each other. And so it's like our thoughts create other thoughts, which create other thoughts, which create other thoughts. But at the same time, our brains are in bodies, and sometimes our body sends us signals, like a rumbly tummy or something like that, that creates a thought like, I should have my lunch now. And our bodies and our brains are in worlds, and those worlds have other people who come up and say to us, I think you should be doing your homework right now. And so what determines what we're thinking and how we're using our brain depends on the interaction between all those different factors.
Can you live with half a brain?
Yes and no. If somebody has a brain injury or a stroke, the larger the portion of the brain that is damaged, the less likely someone is to survive and to fully recover. So if someone has a brain injury that damages half of the brain, it's unlikely, but not impossible, that they'll be able to live. However, there are some cases where people have an operation in which doctors actually remove half of their brain. And this is in cases where people have really bad epilepsy or seizure. And the seizures happen multiple times a day, they don't respond to any kind of medicine, and they only really affect one half of the brain. So the doctors can go in and remove that half of the brain in an operation called a hemispherectomy. And this operation works best in young children because their brains are still developing, and so it can adjust to having one half of the brain taken away, and it can form new connections and compensate for the loss of half of the brain. Most people who have this operation as kids end up living normal lives. The only downside is that they typically have trouble controlling one half of their body, the opposite side of the body, from the part of the brain that was removed, because the brain, one half, will actually control the opposite side of the body. So if you have your right hemisphere removed, then you would have trouble controlling your hands and your limbs on the left side of your body, and usually they would be blind in that opposite eye. But other than that, some epilepsy patients are out there living with only half of a brain.
Which parts of the brain controls which parts of the body?
So this question is about a part of the brain called the motor cortex. And the motor cortex is a strip of brain roughly in a line down here from the top of your head to the ear on the right side, and also another strip from the top of the head to the ear on the left side. And in this part of the brain there are cells which send little electrical signals to the muscle on the opposite side of your body. So the cells in the motor cortex here on my right side of my brain control all the muscles on the left side of my body, and the cells in the motor cortex on the left side of my brain control all the muscles on the right side of my body. So for example, I'm right-handed. When I write my name, I hold my pen in my right hand, and that means it's my left motor cortex which is actually telling all the muscles in my hand how to move my fingers and my wrist to make really nice, clean, tidy handwriting.
Sometimes people say you're a right brain or a left brain. Is that real?
It's real that you have a right brain and a left brain because there are two hemispheres. And also it's true that some of the mental processes we have are lateralized, which means are more on one side of the brain than the other. So for example, if you're right-handed, it's very common, or overwhelmingly the case, that the left brain controls things to do with your speech. If you're left-handed, it's a bit more even whether your right brain or your left brain controls speech. But you shouldn't go overboard on that. It's not true to say that whole people are kind of right brain or left brain in that sense. So while some things are lateralized, people and their brains aren't really.
What are brain tumours?
So brain tumours are when the cells in the brain start to grow in a very uncontrolled way, and they get larger and larger, and that can often cause damage to the healthy bits of the brain. You can find them in lots of different parts of the brain, and they have different names depending on how large they are and where they're found.
How big is the average human brain?
Okay, so you can imagine, so for example, your head like this big, but because your like skull is quite thick, so actually your brain just like this big. So the average long is 15 centimeters, so that's like average people have.
How much does a brain weigh?
Okay, the brain weighs about 1 pound at birth and 2 pounds in primary school, and about 3 pounds as an adult.
How much memory can your brain hold?
As far as we know, there is no limit to how many memories your brain can hold. We have the machinery to hold endless numbers of memory, and as far as we know, no one has ever said, I can't remember anymore, I'm full. There are cases where people say that, but usually that's because part of that brain goes wrong, or because they're tired, or they haven't had their lunch yet. There's some other reason why they can't remember information. But there's nothing intrinsically in the brain that allows you to store or retrieve only so many memories.